For decades, China understood that economic growth alone was not enough. A rising superpower also needed secure energy, protected supply lines, and the ability to survive global shocks. While much of the world focused on China's factories and exports, Beijing was quietly building something deeper, a long-term strategy to make sure no foreign crisis could easily choke its future. In 1991, while much of the world was watching a war unfold in the Persian Gulf, China was watching something else entirely. For many Americans, Operation Desert Storm was remembered as a demonstration of overwhelming military power, advanced technology, and a swift coalition victory. But in Beijing, the lessons were different. Chinese planners were not only focused on tanks crossing the desert or missiles striking targets. They were studying how modern power really worked behind the scenes. They saw that energy routes, shipping lanes, and oil supply chains could be influenced, protected, or disrupted by nations with naval dominance. That realization would stay with China for decades. At the time, China was still in the earlier stages of its economic rise. Factories were expanding, cities were growing, and industrial output was increasing year after year. The country needed more steel, more electricity, more transport, and more fuel to keep that momentum going. Economic reform had created growth, but growth also created a new kind of dependence. Every new highway, every new industrial zone, and every shipment leaving Chinese ports required energy. And energy, especially oil, was becoming more important than ever. Then came another turning point in the same year. In 1991, China crossed a major threshold. It shifted from being a net oil exporter to a net oil importer. For years, China had been able to rely more heavily on domestic production. But demand was now growing faster than supply. That meant the country would increasingly need foreign oil to sustain its development. It was a quiet economic statistic at the time, but strategically, it was massive. It meant China's future growth would no longer depend only on what it could produce inside its borders. It would depend on supplies coming from outside them. For Chinese leaders, that created an uncomfortable reality. A nation of China's size could not afford to have its economic engine tied to external forces it did not control. Oil was not just another commodity. It powered trucks, ships, manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and military logistics. If supply became unstable, growth could slow. If prices surged, industries could suffer. If shipments were interrupted, the consequences could move quickly through the entire economy. What China saw during the Gulf War made this concern more urgent. The conflict highlighted how important the Persian Gulf was to global energy markets and how military power could shape what happened there. It also showed that sea-based trade routes were not neutral spaces. They could be protected by some nations and pressured by others. For a country that was beginning to rely more on imported energy, that was not an abstract geopolitical lesson. It was a warning. China's leadership understood that the country was entering a new phase. Economic success would require resources from abroad, but reliance on those resources could also create strategic weakness. The faster China grew, the more energy it would need. And the more energy it needed, the more vulnerable it could become. That contradiction became one of the most important long-term challenges in modern Chinese planning. Unlike many short-term political systems, China's state planners often think in decades, not election cycles. So instead of treating the issue as a temporary inconvenience, they began to view energy security as a national priority. They asked difficult questions early. What happens if supply routes are threatened? What happens if global conflict disrupts shipping? What happens if a rival power can influence the flow of resources China depends on? Those questions did not produce instant headlines. There was no dramatic announcement and no single master plan revealed to the public. But inside policy circles, the mindset had changed. Energy was no longer just about economics. It was about sovereignty, resilience, and strategic independence. China had learned that a growing economy without secure access to fuel could become exposed in ways that were dangerous and expensive. This is why 1991 mattered so much. It was not simply the year of a distant war. It was the year China recognized that oil could become leverage. It was the year China understood that growth alone was not enough. A country could become richer and stronger, yet still remain vulnerable if others controlled the systems it relied on. That early realization would shape how China viewed the world from that point forward. While others saw a regional war, China saw a preview of future pressure points. And once that lesson was understood, it would not be forgotten. As China's economy accelerated through the late 1990s and early 2000s, one problem became impossible to ignore. The country was growing faster, trading more, consuming more energy, and importing larger volumes of oil every year. On paper, this looked like success, but beneath the surface, China's rising prosperity was increasingly dependent on routes far beyond its borders. The factories, ports, and cities driving China's boom were connected to supply lines that could be pressured from thousands of miles away. This concern eventually became known as the Malacca dilemma, a phrase associated with former Chinese leader Hu Jintao. It described a simple but serious reality. A huge share of China's imported oil had to pass through narrow maritime choke points before reaching Chinese shores. Two of the most critical were Strait of Hormuz and Strait of Malacca. Together, these passages became lifelines for China's economy. The danger was not that these routes were always blocked. The danger was that they could be. Both waterways are narrow, crowded, and strategically sensitive. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, one of the world's most important oil-exporting regions. The Strait of Malacca, between Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. For China, imported oil often had to pass through one, then the other, before reaching home. That meant China's growth was exposed to geography. A military conflict, a regional crisis, piracy, sanctions, or naval pressure could create serious disruption. Even uncertainty alone could send insurance costs higher, raise freight costs, and shake energy markets. China did not need a complete blockade to feel pain. Delays, instability, or fear in those sea lanes could ripple through its economy. From Beijing's perspective, this was more than a shipping issue. It was a national vulnerability. Imagine building the world's second largest economy while knowing a major portion of your energy must move through routes you do not fully control. China's industrial rise depended on imported fuel, yet the arteries carrying that fuel were monitored and influenced by foreign naval powers, especially the United States and its partners. That imbalance was deeply uncomfortable for Chinese strategists. China understood that modern competition was not only about armies or missiles, it was also about logistics. Whoever could secure supply chains held leverage. Whoever depended on vulnerable routes carried risk. For a country trying to rise in a world shaped by existing maritime powers, this was a structural problem that could not be ignored. The phrase Malacca dilemma mattered because it publicly acknowledged something many governments prefer not to admit. Dependence can become weakness. China was saying, in effect, that its economic miracle still had an exposed pressure point. If others could squeeze that point during a crisis, China's momentum could slow dramatically. So, Beijing began to think long-term. Rather than waiting for a future emergency, China started examining how to reduce exposure before a crisis ever happened. It studied pipelines, rail corridors, inland energy routes, strategic reserves, diversified suppliers, and overland connections across Eurasia. The goal was not necessarily to abandon sea trade entirely. That would be unrealistic. The goal was to make sure no single waterway could hold China hostage. This marked a broader shift in Chinese strategic thinking. Instead of accepting the global system exactly as it existed, China started preparing for a world where key routes might become contested. That mindset would influence infrastructure spending, foreign partnerships, energy diplomacy, and transportation networks for years to come. The Malacca dilemma was not just about one strait. It was about a larger fear, that a nation can become powerful, wealthy, and technologically advanced, yet still remain vulnerable if others sit astride its lifelines. China decided that was a risk it could not accept, and once Beijing reached that conclusion, the next step was inevitable. If the old routes were vulnerable, new ones would have to be built. Once China understood the risks of relying too heavily on vulnerable sea lanes, it needed something more than speeches or policy papers. It needed physical alternatives. The first major answer came not across the ocean, but across land. To China's north sat Russia, a nation with vast energy reserves, long borders, and one strategic advantage that mattered more than ever. Oil and gas could move directly into China, without passing through contested waterways. For Beijing, this was highly attractive. Tankers crossing distant oceans could be delayed, rerouted, sanctioned, or threatened during crises. But pipelines crossing territory from a neighboring supplier offered something different: continuity, predictability, and reduced exposure to naval pressure. Energy flowing through steel lines under frozen ground could not be intercepted the same way as oil moving through choke points at sea. That logic helped drive one of the most important energy partnerships in modern Eurasia. China and Russia deepened cooperation around pipeline infrastructure, linking Siberian resources to Chinese demand. One of the most significant projects was the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline, commonly known as ESPO. This network helped route Russian crude from Eastern Siberia toward Asian markets, with dedicated links supplying China directly. The importance of ESPO was not only the volume of oil, it was the route itself. Every barrel that reached China by land reduced dependence on long maritime supply chains. Every expansion of cross-border infrastructure meant China had one more layer of resilience. This was not just energy trade, it was strategic engineering. Then came natural gas. China's industrial expansion and urban growth created rising demand for cleaner burning fuels, especially for electricity, heating, and manufacturing. Again, Russia offered scale and geography. The result was the Power of Siberia pipeline, a landmark project carrying Russian gas directly into China. The symbolism of this pipeline was powerful. Massive quantities of energy were now moving from Siberian fields into Chinese markets through a land corridor largely insulated from maritime disruptions. No narrow straits, no long tanker journeys through contested waters, no reliance on foreign navies to keep the route open. For China, this represented exactly the kind of diversification it had been seeking for years. As global tensions shifted in the 2020s, the relationship became even more important. Since 2024, Russia emerged as China's largest crude oil supplier. That mattered not only in commercial terms, but in geopolitical terms. It showed that China had built a supply channel capable of growing when other systems were under strain. There was another layer to this shift: finance. Increasing portions of trade between China and Russia moved through the Chinese yuan rather than relying solely on the US dollar. For Beijing, this added strategic value. It meant energy security was no longer only about where oil came from, but also about how it was paid for. Supply routes and payment systems were both part of the same larger equation. To many outside observers, pipelines can look dull compared to aircraft carriers or summit meetings. But China has long understood that infrastructure often matters more than headlines. A pipeline can quietly reshape leverage for decades. It can lock in partnerships, stabilize supply, and reduce exposure without firing a shot. Of course, overland energy is not risk-free. Pipelines require political trust, long-term contracts, technical maintenance, and stable cross-border relations. They can be expensive and slow to build. But from China's perspective, those challenges were manageable compared to the possibility of having too much of its economy dependent on sea routes controlled by others. This is why the Siberian connection became so significant. It was one of China's first real escape routes from the vulnerabilities it had identified years earlier. Not a complete solution, but a serious one. It proved China was willing to spend years building alternatives long before the next crisis arrived. While many nations reacted to disruptions after they happened, China was building routes designed to function before disruption began. And across the frozen north, those routes were already delivering. Even with pipelines, ports, and new transport corridors, China understood a hard truth. No supply system is perfect during a global crisis. Ships can be delayed, markets can panic, wars can escalate faster than expected. Diplomatic relations can change overnight. And when that happens, the most valuable resource is not only access to future supply, it is what you already have stored. That realization pushed China toward one of its least visible but most important energy strategies: building enormous underground oil reserves. While much of the world focused on China's skyscrapers, railways, and manufacturing power, another project was expanding quietly beneath the surface. Along parts of China's coastline, engineers carved large storage caverns into solid rock, creating protected spaces capable of holding massive volumes of crude oil and refined fuels. This was not just ordinary tank storage. Traditional above-ground facilities are easier to identify, easier to monitor, and more exposed to weather, sabotage, or attack. Underground caverns offer something different. Hidden within rock formations, they provide natural protection, reduced visibility, and stronger resilience in times of conflict. For a country thinking seriously about worst-case scenarios, that mattered enormously. Over time, analysts estimated China's strategic petroleum reserve and related storage capacity could reach around 1.3 billion barrels. That figure drew global attention because it suggested China was building one of the largest emergency energy cushions in the world, approaching or even surpassing the scale many observers once associated primarily with the United States. The meaning of those numbers goes beyond raw volume. Oil reserves are strategic time. Every barrel stored is time a government can use to stabilize markets, keep transport systems moving, support industry, and prevent panic while external disruptions are managed. Countries with shallow reserves can be forced into rushed decisions. Countries with deep reserves gain breathing room. China clearly valued that breathing room. If maritime routes were interrupted, if conflict in the Middle East sent prices surging, or if sanctions disrupted normal trade patterns, reserves could soften the shock. Factories would not need to stop immediately. Trucks would not halt overnight. Power generation and industrial planning would not instantly collapse into crisis mode. This kind of preparation reflects a broader Chinese mindset. Beijing often plans not only for what is likely, but for what is possible. That means asking uncomfortable questions years in advance. What if shipping lanes close? What if imports slow sharply? What if markets become chaotic for months, not days? Underground reserves are one answer to those questions. There was also a security dimension. Storage buried in rock is harder to target and harder to assess from space compared with visible tank farms. In a world where satellites track infrastructure and military planners study vulnerabilities, concealment has value. The less others know about exact capacity, readiness, and distribution, the more uncertainty China preserves for itself and for rivals. For American viewers, think of it this way. Many countries trust markets to solve shortages. China tends to trust preparation. Rather than assuming global trade will always function smoothly, Beijing has repeatedly invested in buffers that can absorb shocks. Sometimes those buffers are ports, sometimes pipelines. In this case, they were caverns filled with fuel. These reserves also supported China's larger geopolitical confidence. A nation that knows it can endure months of disruption negotiates differently than one living shipment to shipment. Strategic stockpiles can influence diplomacy because they reduce urgency. They allow patience, and patience can become leverage. Critics may debate the exact size, efficiency, or transparency of China's reserves. Those debates matter. But the broader point is difficult to ignore. China spent years and enormous resources preparing for energy emergencies long before many of them arrived. That alone signals how seriously Beijing viewed vulnerability. The world often measures power through aircraft carriers, missiles, or GDP rankings. But hidden beneath stone along China's coast was another form of power: stored endurance. In a future crisis, endurance can matter just as much as strength. China did not simply want more oil, it wanted insurance. And deep underground, it built it. China's rise was never built on growth alone. It was built on preparation, redundancy, and long-term calculation. While many nations reacted to crises after they began, China spent years preparing before they arrived, and that may be one of its greatest strategic advantages today.